Raoul Wallenberg entered Budapest at a moment when the city was standing on the edge of catastrophe. By the time he arrived in the summer of 1944, the Holocaust in Hungary had already reached a speed and scale that shocked even seasoned Nazi officials. In just a few months, hundreds of thousands of Hungarian Jews living in the countryside had been deported to Auschwitz. Villages were emptied almost overnight. Families disappeared so quickly that neighbors sometimes discovered abandoned homes with food still on the table, as if life had simply been paused and erased. Budapest remained different, but not because it was safe. It was different because it was last. Nearly 200,000 Jews were still alive in the capital, and everyone understood that once the Nazis turned their full attention there, the destruction would be total. Adolf Eichmann himself had arrived to oversee the operation, bringing with him a cold efficiency perfected in earlier deportations across Europe. What had not yet happened in Budapest was not mercy. It was timing. Hungary had been an ally of Nazi Germany, but for years its leaders had resisted mass deportations, fearing unrest and economic collapse. That resistance ended abruptly in March 1944 when German troops occupied the country. From that moment on, Hungarian Jews were no longer a political problem to be managed. They were targets to be eliminated. Raoul Wallenberg was 31 years old when he stepped into this world. He was not a traditional diplomat shaped by decades of cautious service. He came from a wealthy and influential Swedish family, but his own life had taken a winding path. He studied architecture in the United States, traveled widely, and worked in international trade. These experiences gave him something many diplomats lacked: a sharp sense of reality and an understanding of how systems actually functioned under pressure. Before Budapest, Wallenberg had already seen the effects of Nazi persecution. He had Jewish business partners whose lives were dismantled piece by discriminatory laws. He listened to stories of fear and flight long before the world fully understood what was happening. These encounters left a deep impression. He did not see the crisis as abstract politics. He saw it as human destruction unfolding in slow motion. When the United States War Refugee Board searched for someone willing to go to Hungary, they needed more than sympathy. They needed boldness, creativity, and a willingness to act without constant permission. Sweden, neutral during the war, provided diplomatic cover. Wallenberg provided everything else. From the moment he arrived in Budapest in July 1944, Wallenberg understood that normal diplomatic behavior would fail. Appeals to law or humanity meant nothing to men who had already overseen mass murder. What they respected was authority, paperwork, and the fear of consequences. So Wallenberg decided to turn the Nazis' own obsession with bureaucracy against them. He began issuing Schutzpass, or protective passports, documents declaring the holder to be under Swedish protection. On paper, these passes were meant for a limited number of people. In practice, Wallenberg ignored the limits. He expanded definitions, stretched legal language, and issued far more documents than he was authorized to produce. What mattered was not technical legality, but appearance. The documents looked official. They carried seals, signatures, and the name of a neutral nation. In a system where paperwork determined fate, that was often enough. Wallenberg did not wait for people to come to him quietly. He went into the streets. When Jews were rounded up and herded toward trains, he followed. Witnesses later described scenes that bordered on the unreal. Wallenberg standing on car roofs, shouting names. Wallenberg forcing his way through armed guards. Wallenberg waving documents inches from the faces of SS officers and demanding immediate releases. He behaved as though his authority were absolute. Often, the officers hesitated. They argued among themselves. No one wanted to be responsible for creating a diplomatic incident with Sweden. That hesitation, that moment of uncertainty, saved lives. But paper alone could not protect everyone. Wallenberg knew that people needed physical shelter. He began renting buildings throughout Budapest and declaring them Swedish safe houses. Swedish flags were hung prominently. Signs announced diplomatic protection. Thousands of Jews crowded inside these buildings, living in terrible conditions but shielded, at least temporarily, from deportation. Food was scarce. Disease spread easily. Fear never fully disappeared. But inside these buildings, there was a fragile sense of safety. Time, more than comfort, was what Wallenberg was buying for them. Time meant survival. As summer turned to autumn, the situation grew worse. The Arrow Cross, Hungary's fascist militia, gained power and unleashed a wave of terror. They beat and executed Jews openly, dragging people from homes and shooting them along the banks of the Danube, where bodies were thrown into the river. The streets of Budapest became scenes of sudden, unpredictable violence. Wallenberg became a target. Arrow Cross members despised him and mocked his protections. They threatened him repeatedly. His diplomatic immunity, strong on paper, could easily have failed in the chaos. Wallenberg understood this. He continued anyway. He worked almost without rest. He coordinated with other neutral diplomats, including representatives from Switzerland, Spain, and the Vatican, but he pushed further than most. Where others hesitated, he acted. He bribed officials when necessary. He forged documents when required. He threatened future war crimes trials before such trials even existed. By late 1944, the Soviet Red Army was approaching Budapest. As defeat loomed, Nazi and Arrow Cross brutality intensified. Death marches were organized, forcing Jews to walk toward Austria in freezing conditions. Thousands collapsed and died along the roads. Wallenberg followed these marches in his car. He distributed food when he could. He handed out protective passes. He physically pulled people out of columns, loading them into vehicles under the eyes of armed guards. Survivors later recalled seeing him appear suddenly, as if from nowhere, intervening at the last possible moment. One of Wallenberg's most critical actions came when he learned of a plan to liquidate the Budapest ghetto entirely. Tens of thousands of people were trapped inside. If the order were carried out, it would have been one of the final mass killings of the Holocaust. Wallenberg acted immediately. Through intermediaries, he contacted German General Schmidt-Huber and issued a direct threat. He warned that if the ghetto were destroyed, Schmidt-Huber would be held personally responsible and prosecuted for war crimes after the war. The threat was credible. Everyone knew Germany was losing. The order was cancelled. That decision saved tens of thousands of lives. By January 1945, Budapest was collapsing. Street fighting raged. Bombings destroyed entire neighborhoods. Civilians hid in basements as the city starved. When Soviet troops finally entered, Nazi control disintegrated almost overnight. For the Jews of Budapest, survival came at an unimaginable cost, but survival came. Many knew exactly whom they owed their lives to. They spoke his name again and again. Raoul Wallenberg. When Soviet troops finally pushed into Budapest in January 1945, the city they found was shattered. Streets were filled with rubble, buildings burned from the inside out, and civilians moved like shadows between ruins. Hunger was everywhere. So was trauma. For the Jewish survivors emerging from cellars, safe houses, and the remains of the ghetto, liberation felt unreal. Many were too weak to celebrate. Many had lost entire families. Survival itself felt like a burden they were not yet sure how to carry. Raoul Wallenberg moved through this chaos with the same urgency that had defined his work under Nazi rule. His concern did not end with liberation. Tens of thousands of Jews needed food, medical care, shelter, and protection from revenge killings and lawlessness. He understood that the collapse of one brutal system did not automatically create safety. Power vacuums were dangerous, and Budapest was full of them. Wallenberg began organizing relief efforts immediately. He worked to secure supplies, identify survivors, and protect those still vulnerable. He believed his neutral status and his record of humanitarian action would allow him to work with the incoming Soviet authorities. Like many at the time, he viewed the Red Army primarily as liberators from Nazi terror. What he did not fully understand was that he was stepping into another system defined by suspicion, secrecy, and absolute control. On January 17, 1945, Wallenberg left one of his protected buildings, reportedly to meet with Soviet commanders to discuss post-war aid and reconstruction. He never returned. At first, confusion reigned. Some believed he had been killed in the fighting. Others thought he had been detained briefly and would be released. Days turned into weeks, then months. No clear information emerged. Eventually, it became apparent that Wallenberg had been arrested by Soviet counterintelligence and taken east. Why this happened remains one of the great unanswered questions of the 20th century. Some theories suggested that the Soviets suspected Wallenberg of espionage because of his connections with the United States War Refugee Board. Others pointed to his frequent contact with German officials during rescue operations, which may have appeared suspicious to Soviet intelligence. There were also rumors of denunciations, misunderstandings, or simple paranoia in a system that trusted no one. What is certain is that Wallenberg disappeared into the Soviet prison system. For years, the Soviet Union denied knowledge of his fate. At times, officials claimed he was never detained. At other times, they suggested he had died of illness shortly after his arrest. In 1957, the Soviets stated that Wallenberg had died in Lubyanka prison in Moscow in 1947. They provided no body, no detailed records, and no credible explanation. Survivors refused to accept this. Over decades, former prisoners emerged claiming they had seen Wallenberg alive long after 1947 in various Soviet prisons and labor camps. Some testimonies were contradictory. Others were strikingly consistent. Files were sealed. Archives were incomplete. The truth remained buried beneath layers of secrecy. While Wallenberg vanished, his legacy among survivors only grew stronger. For those he saved, he was not a distant historical figure. He was the man who had pulled them from lines, who had shouted at armed guards, who had handed them papers when death felt inevitable. Survivors remembered his voice, his posture, his refusal to back down. Many remembered his name before they even knew what country Sweden was. In the immediate post-war years, Hungarian Jews faced a difficult reality. Anti-Semitism had not disappeared. Homes were destroyed or occupied. Families were gone. Many chose to leave Hungary altogether, seeking new lives in Israel, the United States, and elsewhere. Wherever they went, the story of Raoul Wallenberg traveled with them. Children were named after him. His photograph was passed around like a relic. People kept their Schutzpass documents for decades, not as proof of survival, but as proof that someone had cared. Sweden, meanwhile, struggled with its own response. The Swedish government made inquiries but did so cautiously, careful not to antagonize the Soviet Union during the emerging Cold War. This caution angered many survivors and historians, who felt that Wallenberg deserved a louder, more persistent defense. Over time, pressure mounted, and Sweden increased its efforts, but by then years had already passed. Internationally, Wallenberg's story began to spread. Researchers documented his actions. Historians verified survivor accounts. The scale of his rescue became clearer with each study. Conservative estimates credited him with saving at least 100,000 Jews. Some scholars argued the number was even higher when indirect effects were included. He was granted honorary citizenship by multiple countries. Streets, schools, and monuments were named after him. Israel honored him as righteous among the nations. In the United States, his name was entered into the congressional record. Canada and Australia followed with similar recognitions. Yet none of these honors answered the central question. What happened to him? The mystery became part of his legacy, a haunting reminder that moral courage does not guarantee protection. Wallenberg had survived the Nazi killing machine only to be consumed by another system that viewed independent actors as threats. His story forces a confrontation with uncomfortable truths about power. Wallenberg was effective precisely because he acted independently, bending rules, exploiting gray areas, and refusing to accept official limitations. Those same qualities made him dangerous to authoritarian systems that demanded absolute loyalty. But his life also offers something else: proof that individuals matter. The Holocaust was a system built on obedience. Millions died not only because of ideological hatred, but because countless people followed orders, filled out forms, guarded trains, and chose compliance over conscience. Wallenberg disrupted that system by refusing to behave as expected. He demonstrated that even within oppressive structures, choices exist. His courage was not the loud courage of battlefield heroics. It was the grinding, exhausting courage of daily confrontation. It was the courage to argue, to insist, to risk humiliation, arrest, or death for strangers. It was the courage to treat paperwork as a weapon against murder. In Budapest, that courage changed the course of thousands of lives. Today, Raoul Wallenberg is remembered not only as a rescuer, but as a moral benchmark. His actions raise a question that remains painfully relevant. What is our responsibility when laws and orders demand participation in injustice? Wallenberg did not overthrow regimes. He did not stop the war. But he created space for survival where none should have existed. He proved that neutrality does not have to mean passivity, and that diplomacy does not have to mean silence. His disappearance adds a final layer of tragedy, but it does not diminish his achievement. If anything, it sharpens it. He paid the ultimate price not because he failed, but because he succeeded too visibly. Budapest survived. Tens of thousands lived. Entire generations exist because one man refused to accept that nothing could be done. That truth endures, even as questions about his fate remain unanswered. And in a century marked by cruelty on an unimaginable scale, the legacy of Raoul Wallenberg stands as a reminder that courage does not always announce itself with noise or glory. Sometimes it arrives quietly, carrying documents, knocking on doors, and refusing to leave until lives are saved. As decades passed, Raoul Wallenberg's absence became as powerful as his presence had once been. The silence surrounding his fate was not empty. It was filled with unanswered questions, half-opened archives, and the persistent voices of those who refused to let his story fade. Survivors aged, witnesses died, governments changed, but the mystery endured. Former prisoners of the Soviet Gulag continued to come forward well into the late 20th century, claiming they had encountered a foreign diplomat who matched Wallenberg's description. Some said he was held under another name. Others said he was isolated, questioned repeatedly, moved from prison to prison. While not all testimonies could be verified, their consistency troubled historians. The possibility that Wallenberg lived for years, perhaps decades, after his official date of death could not be fully dismissed. Investigations were launched. Swedish-Russian commissions examined archives. Some documents were released, others withheld. Gaps remained where answers should have been. The truth appeared fragmented, deliberately obscured by a system that did not admit mistakes, especially those involving wrongful imprisonment. For survivors, the uncertainty was painful but secondary to what Wallenberg represented. He had stood between them and annihilation at a moment when the world largely looked away. That fact alone defined him. As time moved on, his story entered classrooms, documentaries, and memorials. Students learned that resistance did not always wear uniforms or carry weapons. It could wear a suit, carry a briefcase, and speak calmly in the face of brutality. Wallenberg became an example not only of courage, but of moral imagination, the ability to see options where others saw none. In Hungary, where anti-Semitism and historical denial remained contentious issues, Wallenberg's legacy became a touchstone. Monuments were erected near the Danube, close to where Arrow Cross militias had murdered thousands. His name became inseparable from the memory of survival in Budapest, a counterweight to the city's darkest chapter. What makes Wallenberg's story endure is not only the number of lives he saved, but how he saved them. He did not wait for permission. He did not hide behind procedure. He accepted that acting rightly might mean acting alone. In doing so, he exposed a truth that remains uncomfortable. Systems commit crimes, but individuals allow them to function. Wallenberg's choices challenge the idea that people are powerless within history. He operated inside immense forces, Nazism, war, totalitarianism, and yet he carved out space for human life. His example does not suggest that courage is easy or without cost. It suggests that courage is costly, and that the cost must sometimes be paid willingly. In the end, Raoul Wallenberg left no memoir, no final testimony, no explanation for his choices beyond simple humanity. Perhaps that is why his story resonates so deeply. It does not belong to ideology or nationality. It belongs to anyone who has ever faced a moment where doing nothing was safer, and doing something was right. His fate may never be fully known, but his impact is undeniable. Every life he saved stands as an answer to the question of whether one person can matter. He did. And because he did, the silence that surrounds his disappearance is filled with lives lived, families formed, and futures that were once almost erased.